Number two. What branch did you serve with?
What branch of the service?
You know, people have asked me that 3 times, and I have a difficult time finding an answer because I'm not attuned to saying anything other than in the Army. Now, I don't know if that's a branch or not. I had an experience. This is totally off the cuff, and it has nothing to do with anything we've ever talked about before, because we haven't talked very much before. I think it was maybe once. But on the way back over here tonight, I shouldn't say back, because I wasn't here before, I get hung up on language sometimes.
We're doing great.
Yeah, but on the way over here tonight, I realized suddenly that I was sitting in, and being pushed or pulled or however someone proceeds when they're in a device that takes them where they're safe. And I think you know the name of what that.
A wheelchair?
A wheelchair.
Wheelchair.
Yes, I don't like to use that word.
Okay.
That would make me seem old.
Okay.
Yeah. But as I rode along there, I realized that suddenly I had exited the plane first. And so I was driving along, and there were lots of people there waving at me. And of course I realized, they're not really waving at me, they're waving at all the crowd behind me. And so I started to wave back a little bit. And that went on for quite a while. And then, as I reached the finish line, I suddenly realized I started in the Army as a private. I ended in the Army not much more than that. And here I am, driving ahead, half an army behind me, and they're all following me. Why did I ever leave?
That's right, you're in charge and they were waiting for you, and that's a good lesson to all of you. And Senator Watson's comments are pertinent. This is for you individually, and they are waving at you, and they are shaking your hand. And please do acknowledge them as you travel about the city tomorrow. Wave back, shake their hands, tell them thank you as they thank you for your service. But one of the things I wanted to ask you about, you told me you were an MP, and where did you serve?
When?
Where?
Where did you serve?
In Japan.
In Japan.
I served in Japan. I enlisted. I enlisted when I was 17 years old, and at that time, all of the bad stuff in Japan had ended, but peace had not been totally signed, and so that put me as a I guess it formally defined me together with others who were in just about that time, which was 1956, as in World War II. And I was reluctant for a long time to, when they, you get in the crowd and once in a while they'll want to know how many veterans are in the crowd, and they say, well, how many served at this time, or how many served at that time, in what field? And when they would say, how many served in World War II, I was always reluctant to raise my hand, because I knew that what I was doing, while it was very different, and I'm going to get to that, I think, while it was very different, I was not really in danger. And the reason why I'll tell you in a minute. And it took me a long time before I felt comfortable raising my hand when how many served in World War II.
And you served as a guard at a prisoner of war camp.
I served as soon as I arrived in Japan after enlisting at a high school. I was sent across the ocean, not knowing where I was going, but knowing that everyone else on the boat had been told, whatever happens you don't want to end up north of Japan in what eventually turned out to be a war that probably was as destructive as any that we've had. So, go ahead.
So you told me a while ago about the policy when you were a prison guard and the policies that you were told and the treatment you were told to give to the Japanese prisoners and how you felt that affected our overall relationship. Can you talk? Just how were you told to treat the Japanese?
The next step in my too lengthy tale. As soon as I got off the boat, we were all called out for an address by, I don't know, I think he was a high-level sergeant or someone. but he was someone who was able to speak in our language. And the most important thing he told us is that we were now in a country that we had just downed in a terrible war, but we were not to behave or treat with these people as their conquerors. We were to look at them and view them for what we wanted them to be, and that was our friends. And that came pretty straight from General MacArthur. General MacArthur was a pretty controversial figure, as probably many of you know. There were people who liked him and there were people who didn't like him. But he probably had as great or more influence on bringing Japan into our family of nations that could oppose others in the world that eventually would become as dangerous as they had been. And that's the way we had to behave. After that, I ended up, and I guess you might say I had some opportunity to practice that, because I ended up being assigned to Sagamo Prison. Sagamo Prison was a prison in Tokyo. It was a Japanese prison for civilians before the war started. When we bombed Tokyo, that facility sat right in the midst of, obviously all I had to do was look out, and I would see from devastation that almost every house that was there, and the houses weren't very big to begin with, was no longer a house. It was a bunch of sticks. I was reminded of the scenes that I could recall during the Depression when I was just a kid in New Jersey, and how our poor people in the Depression were living in shacks, basically, that they salvaged from scrap. And that's what the Japanese people were living in at that time. But in the midst of that devastation, we let Sagamo Prison alone, because that was being looked ahead towards a facility to put those Japanese who deserved to be brought to trial. And it was sort of like the Nuremberg situation, Nuremberg trials, which had already taken place. So at the time I was sent there, I was, the trials were in Yokohama, so they would move those on trial from Tokyo to Yokohama. And my first assignment was as a guard there, and I never had the chance to actually ride to in the van to the trials. Although when they came back, I remember once I had an opportunity to accompany one of them. It was the one who had a wooden leg, And I remember it so distinctly because he had to take his leg off every time he came back, and I had the opportunity to carry his leg off. So that was the closest opportunity I had to get to know some of those prisoners, because
We're gonna let some of the other folks. Yeah, we're gonna. But I tell you, when he told me earlier today, he said some of these prisoners were guilty of war crimes, some were being held to be witnesses, and some were probably innocent. And I think it was just a real insight of the American people and who we are as a people to say, let's treat these enemies of ours as human beings and who we want them to be instead of who they were to us. And I was inspired by your story, Bill. Thank you so much. Let's give Bill a hand, please.